So I want to take you back to a time in my life. It was 2013. I was new to ministry, just got through my first year of div school. I was a summer intern at the UU congregation, the First Church of Cleveland in Shaker Heights, Ohio, which was right near my hometown. It was kind of perfect to stay with my parents, went to my summer internship, you know. Over that past year, from 2012 to 2013, I had been struggling with my own identity as a bisexual woman. I had fallen in love with a woman who I then would become my wife, who now is my wife. At the congregation, I didn't really know how to be a minister who was out. I didn't know how to do ministry in my new identity. And there I was looking at the wall. Not every congregation has this, our congregation doesn't, but some congregations, you see the wall of ministers, you know, like the portraits of all the people who preach there. And at this congregation, at this one, hold on. Sorry for doing this. These faces were at the beginning of the wall. Huh, interesting. These founding ministers of the First Church of Cleveland, the neighborhood church I knew about growing up in Ohio, the people who founded it were a lesbian couple? What? Excuse me? How did I not know about this? What? Yeah, back in the late 1800s, two women who were, in their own writings, partners for life, who sat at each other's deathbeds, founded the Shaker Heights congregation. They were part of the prophetic sisterhood of women spreading Unitarianism across the Midwest and West called the Iowa Sisterhood. And for me, in 2013, I felt like history was reaching across time to me as a minister, saying, you got this. It's gonna be okay. You can be a minister and be who you are. But what I thought was so interesting in seeing their portraits on the wall is that immediately after them was a line of male ministers in black and white photos until the present day. And I was confused as to what happened to get us there. So today I want to share with you some of the stories of the wild women of the West, our Unitarian women who started so many Unitarian Universalist congregations. They built and founded communities, homes, and congregations, and sadly often, once ministries were well established and doing well, and due to the passing of time and economy, they disappeared and were relegated to the annals of history. So I explore this history with you today because it's just pretty darn cool. I am using, most of the things in here are not my original ideas. They come from the book, Cynthia Grant Tucker's book, Prophetic Sisterhood, Liberal Women Ministers of the 1880s and 1930s, and they come from Reverend Kimberly Comstock Carlson's sermon. So please know that I am leaning on women for these ideas as well. By exploring these stories, I want us to get a sense of the feminist liberation, frontier spirit, and the forming edge of new liberal religious practice that happened around the time of the Old West in the 1880s. Our story starts with these two women, Mary Sappert and Eleanor Gordon. Mary Sappert and Eleanor were lifelong neighbors and friends growing up in Hamilton, Illinois, next to each other on farms. They both loved to read, and Mary actually has stories of being a 10-year-old standing on a tree stump preaching to her family, which her mom and dad would just shake off as like, I guess my kid is doing this, okay. And never really take her seriously, because why would they take a 10-year-old girl seriously when preaching on a tree stump? Well, they would eventually take her more seriously, because it was in time, as she kept reading and discovering some of the more liberal tracts of Jefferson and Ralph Waldo Emerson in her father's library, that she would be called to become a Unitarian minister. And her friend Eleanor was also inspired by her and wanted to become an assistant principal. They found each other kind of like two sides of a coin, one who wanted to spread the word through preaching and one who wanted to spread the word through teaching. They first started, however, not in religious life. They started at the Hawthorne Literary Society. They created a literary society for women to gain them more access to education, to circles of influence. And it was there that they often invited a nearby Unitarian minister to speak. They liked him so much, they kept bringing him back. The more he spoke, he's like, I'm not the smartest in the room here. These women are great. He actually was the one who was like, yeah, Mary, please go on and become a minister. It would be fantastic. And he was the person that connected Mary to the person who would make all of this start. Jenkin Lloyd Jones. Jenkin Lloyd Jones was the head of the Unitarian Western Conference. At the time, it meant any Unitarian churches that were from Ohio to like Iowa, California, right? That was all considered the West. Remember, this is the 1880s, right? So the West was still expanding. There weren't a lot of UU congregations in the West, or if there were, they were really struggling because they were poor and didn't have a lot of money. And you see, Jenkin Lloyd Jones had a problem. Young seminarians were not intrigued to go out to what they considered the border of civilization. Remember those outlaws, the Old West? They didn't want to go there. They also didn't want to have that little of pay. But he saw an opportunity in these women, and these women found their freedom and opportunity in this. He's like, hey, we got communities that want to start up in Iowa. Do you want to come in Humboldt, Iowa? And Mary and Eleanor are like, yeah, let's go. So they were invited to start Unity Church in Humboldt, Iowa. And reminiscent of the emerging ideas of Unitarianism at the time, they had very liberal Unitarian phrasing I think that you will find equal respect with. The messages on the doors of that Humboldt church were freedom, fellowship, and character in religion, right? And another one was truth for authority, not authority for truth. A very particular reason and conscience being guiding lights of spirituality, right? Mary Safford followed the influence of more liberal emerging transcendentalist thoughts like William Channing Gannett and other people for this idea of true religion. She believed, quote, true religion must be free religion, free from irrational dogma that discouraged personal growth. Some of that we heard in her speech earlier, right? So as Mary and Eleanor started the congregation in Iowa, she was surprised to see the warm response of people in Iowa. This was a small town just emerging. There weren't really infrastructures. There weren't schools. There was a lot of need and a little money, right? But people desperately wanted this. And she had a philosophy that took the church beyond preaching on Sundays. With the help of Eleanor, they created educational programs both on Sundays and throughout the week. They started their own schools. They also developed lay leaders who would help manage the congregational life, but also would occasionally preach on Sundays. And she set up charity and community work. Understand at this time, in the institutional churches of the East, there was very much a focus on academic rigor and theological study. Male ministers kind of didn't visit people pastorally. They kind of stopped. It was going out of vogue. Right? This is not that kind of ministry. These women wanted to connect with people. They went to their marriages. They went to their funerals. They checked in on them when they were sick. They helped create community and the kind of holistic fellowship life that we are used to now. Mary and Eleanor also endowed the congregation with a fierce sense of responsibility of self-independence. At the time when you were starting congregations, kind of like now, you could get money from the denomination to help you start it out. Mary didn't want that at all. And there was a few reasons why. She didn't want to talk to the all-male authority in the East that looked down on these frontier women and thought that they shouldn't even be starting congregations. They shouldn't even be preaching, right? She had no desire to be funded or treated as a charity by the same men who didn't think that they should be ministers. So instead, she successfully raised all of the money to build new churches. Understand that these were poor people in the frontier. This was hard work, but she made it happen. They say in the book that she was kind of like a motherly figure who's like, hey, it's your responsibility to keep the fellowship going. You gonna give some money? You gonna make this happen? And she did. She successfully raised the money to actually build these new structures and these congregations. Over time, this parish became more and more, aware. Because this was a new, novel thing, there were thousands flocking to the congregation at the time, right? So the word spread around, and this congregation became a magnet for women who wanted to enter liberal religion, or women who just wanted to learn more. Many of these women had a hard time getting formal education, and many were self-taught. So Mary herself was ordained without formal training. It's not that she didn't want it. She had applied to Meadville and other places, and either couldn't afford it or was barred from entering. So she taught herself, and the congregation ordained her, right? The few women who did succeed at going to seminary had many institutional attempts from the denomination to make them more conservative in their thought, much more like their Christian counterparts in Boston, which ruffled the feathers of many of these emerging feminist, much more transcendental or humanist ministers, right? Quote, as Sadfer summed it up in her talk to her colleagues on liberal religious leadership, their mission as pastors and feminists must be a ministry that emerged from an understanding of God as the harmonizing power that worked toward a larger state of love in communities, families, and friendships, end quote. I love that quote because how true over 200 years later, when our faith literally put love at the center of our values, would her own understanding of Unitarian Universalism become? Many of the women who had become liberal ministers across the Midwest and West were unmarried, in part because they saw their trajectory of careers and their freedom not able to be compatible with the institutions of marriage at the time. Many of these women instead found the support they needed for their work in their deepest supporting relationships of other women. Many of them friendships and societies, and yes, some of them, like Florence and Marion, end up being much more like partners for life, which is pretty radical for the 1880s, if I may say so myself. And it may have started with Mary and Eleanor, but their home became a beacon and grew to include Mary Edith Colson and Ida Holton. They were teenagers and were tutored by Mary and Eleanor. And Ida would go on to be a minister who started a congregation in Algona, Iowa, and then would mentor Rowena Morse, who would later be ordained by Third Unitarian Church in Chicago. Eventually, Mary and Eleanor were called to found another church in Sioux City, Iowa. Luckily, they connected with Marion Murdoch, who, with the help of her sister, went then to Humboldt to continue running that church. Marion would eventually go on to co-pastor with Carolyn Bartlett Crane, another childhood friend of Mary and Eleanor, to start a church in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And there, Marion would meet Florence, a local assistant principal, who they became quickly attached to each other. Florence wanted to later become a minister, and Marion and Florence founded the Unitarian Church of Cleveland, and so on, and so forth, and so on, until eventually there was a total group of 21 women ministers and 18 Unitarian societies that were founded by them. These are societies stretching from Ohio all the way to Iowa. One of these women was Gertrude von Pletzold, who would go on to become the first woman minister in England. To give you a sense of them. These are only a few. These are only a few. Isn't this incredible? Isn't this history amazing? I love these stories. I love these historical stories. And I didn't even go into every single one of these women. Every single one of these women have their own legacy. Some of them were journalists. Many of them ended up being suffragists. Some of them even ran for office. Some of them started schools and literary societies and educational forces. This is incredible. And we forget that so many of our own congregations were literally founded and would not exist without these women. I share this history not only because I think it's really cool, but also because of what the lessons these women teach us can teach our faith today. These women teach us the kind of freedom that can be gained within the confines and delegations of what others have disregarded, right? Let me make it clear that none of these women would have been able to secure a pulpit anywhere in the East. They would have been ignored or denied because how can women be pastors? And yet they found their frontier. They found their ability to just do it themselves in the West. Many of them were denied the ability to go to seminary. But did these women let that stop them? Absolutely not. They knew they were just as called, just as righteous, just as able to be ministers, and possibly to even do it better than the men did. But they did it in the place where others didn't want to go, the border of civilization, the Wild West, right? Today, we have a lot of institutions that are trying to make particular identities and say what you can and cannot do, what you can and cannot say, to regulate and control what is or isn't possible. Guess what? We can do it anyway. We can create mutual aid. We can create communities. We can keep education going. We can build our frontier right here where we are, right? Secondly, what I find so inspiring about this history is that these women redefined and embodied what whole religious life looked like. While in the academic and institutional congregations of the East, there was a focus on the intellectual sermon, on theology, and on academic life, they had created real, embodied, loving communities. What Mary said in her reading, not denying the heart just for the head, holding both of them. Trust me, these women were just as intellectual, if not more, than the men. They created literary societies, right? Don't get it twisted. They were very, very rigorously smart. But they also wanted to care for people. They created charity work. They cultivated lay leaders. They went and did pastoral visits. They even started things that would follow into our congregations today. They took a holistic look at religious life, and that would become the future. And thirdly, like that, I was honestly surprised in reading this history how much of our modern notions of fellowship life started back then with these women. They had the philosophy that religious education started with parents in the home. Where have we heard that recently? I don't know, every RE Marginal you probably went to in the last 20 years. Did you know that they revived baby dedications that had been going out of fashion in the East, and they modified them to dip a rose in water and touch a child so that they would know love, like we do today in our traditions. So many of our ways of doing fellowship life came from these quite literal pioneers of faith. These people who went beyond the bounds of gender, who went beyond the bounds of theology, ideology, and circumstance. Many who would go on to fight for suffrage. I don't really have a clear answer as to why they faded from history in the 20th century. It's kind of murky. Some of the reasons may be shifting economies of the West and Midwest. Some of them may be that there was a swell of evangelism that happened to spread, as well as a swell of social gospel that made mainline Protestant churches almost as appealing as Unitarian or Universalist ones. And it could be that there was a denominational push against women's ordination at the turn of the 1900s after they saw that fewer and fewer men were going to seminary. Whatever the reason, or all of them combined, many of these churches would either struggle and disappear, or would go on to have male leadership once everything was set up and comfy for them to come in and start preaching from. And these women would either continue on in religious life until they died, or go into more secular and suffrage movement work in the 1900s. But regardless of how they faded from history, their legacy is literally with us today. And right now in this Women's History Month, we are seeing attacks on anyone identified as women or gender nonconforming people. We are watching while laws about name changes might disenfranchise both thousands of trans people, but thousands of married women from the right to vote across all of our states. The right that so many of these exact women fought for, right? We're seeing more restrictive policies on our healthcare. We're watching women get thrown out of town halls. It's a frightening time to be and identify as a woman in the United States today. And yet, as these women attest to, as our ancestors attest to, Unitarian Universalist women are a force that should not be underestimated or reckoned with. We can create the communities of mutual aid and a frontier right here, regardless of what institutions tell us they can do. And the insights of our foremothers and grandmothers' legacy should not be forgotten. The same tools of the Iowa Sisterhood can be used by all of us, regardless of gender. Community-centered work, the power of the hearth and home, the necessity of education. These are the same tools we can use to build resilience and resistance. I invite us to blaze a trail in our own Wild West frontier, to get ready to build even more free faith in these harsh and hard times. So to end this sermon, I'm going to do something a little different. I invite Carol up. I'm going to leave these photos of women up while I sing a hymn. This hymn was written by Mary Satford, going to the tune of hymn number 35 in our hymnal. You don't sing along with me. I'll just try to sing it for you to the best of my ability. But the words, I feel, do emphasize this idea of religious life as home and the free religious search for truth that she was trying to embody. So, thank you, Carol. 1, 2. I think it's 4 verses. 4 verses. Thank you. Sorry. Prayed over soul and into heart, of whom we feel ourselves a part, to whom all souls forever tend. Our Father, Mother, nearest friend, this church with love to thee we bring, and while our spirits in thee sing, we pray that it may ever be a home for all who seek for thee, the home of faith in all things true, a faith that seeks the larger view, the home of love that yearns to bless, the home of truth and righteousness. One more. Long may it stand, the outward sign of that indwelling life divine, which makes thy children truly free, and draws them ever nearer thee. There ends our sermon. Thank you, everyone.